This week we are continuing our exploration of the short story. In your other assignments this week, you will be beginning to plan the short story that you will be writing and looking at the different elements that make up a short story. So for our direct instruction this week, we're going to first start with the elements of plot. The first element of plot is the exposition. The exposition is the beginning part of your story. This introduces the narrator, describes his or her personality, introduces probably a couple of the main characters, as well as the setting. This sets up the rest of your story. So it's important that you take some time to develop your exposition, although remember that this is a short story, so your exposition can't go on for pages and pages and pages. Normally you would consider the exposition to be maybe the first page, page and a half of your story, depending upon the length, whereas for a novel, the exposition may be the first chapter or even the first 2 chapters. It provides the information that your reader's going to need to know to make sense of what's going to happen in the rest of the story. The second element of plot is the rising action. The rising action is where you begin to introduce the conflict and the tension begins to rise and to increase. So we have a lot of events happening, things that move our story along. The third part of the plot is called the climax. This is the high point of your story. This is where all of the tension and the conflict finally reaches its boiling point and becomes to a resolution. The fourth part of your story is the falling action. This is where that problem is solved, and we begin to see the tension subside and the characters come to some realization. The falling action is probably very short as well, okay, as we begin to wrap up the story. The final part of the element of the plot is the resolution. This is where you tie up any loose ends and you bring your story to a close. You want this to happen quickly so that your reader isn't bored, but not so quickly that your reader doesn't know what happened and that the story just seems to die off immediately. Here is an example of a plot diagram that's used to sketch out your elements of plot. The exposition would be flat, the rising action as the tension mounts, the climax being the highest, most intense part of the story, the falling action, the tension decreasing, and the resolution being the ending to the story. This student example, the student created the plot diagram. This is one of the types of diagrams I said that you could use for your planning. He added several elements to the rising action. He showed his plans for making the conflict stronger, and he shows what he's going to do as his climax and how he's going to end his story. One thing you want to make sure you do throughout both your planning and as we begin writing our draft next week is that we're providing enough details. Details and planning create the framework for your story. So we want to make sure that we have enough information to keep our readers interested and to have a good structure for what our story is going to end up looking like. We want to fill in the details to create a complete picture. We want to make sure that we're not leaving too much out and that our short story isn't too short. We want to keep it interesting. We want to keep it lively. And the way we do that is by giving enough detail to our reader. The other thing that we need to know is we need to decide what to tell and what to leave out. This is a short story, so we cannot go on for 4 pages about the color of the main character's dress for the dance, okay, or how the ballroom was decorated for an event, okay. We have to decide what details are important to our story and what are not. It is just as what you decide to put into the story is just as important as what you decide to leave out. So make sure that what you're including moves the story along, and what you're leaving out isn't important stuff that you should have left in. Another important aspect of writing a short story is remembering to show, don't tell. Challenge yourself to show more and tell less. Use action to move your story along. Okay? Description is great, and we want a little bit of description, but we want action in our characters so that we can move the story from one scene to the next, from one place to the next, rather quickly, because we only have a maximum of 15 pages. We want to use things like repetition to stress emotion, and we want to use dialogue to illustrate the characters' personalities. So don't tell me that a character was nice or intelligent. Show me through dialogue that the character was nice, that the character was intelligent, or through the character's actions. Here's some examples of telling versus showing. Okay, with action, it was a dark and stormy night. That's telling, okay? Rather, you can show by saying something like, Andy squinted in the darkness, pulled his coat closer around him, and walked headlong into the rain. Says the same thing. We can infer from that second paragraph, or that second sentence, that it is at night, and it is storming. But it's much more interesting and much more descriptive, and actually reveals a lot more about our character. For the second example, repetition. She was nervous as she walked. Okay, but that's telling me she was nervous. How can you show me that she was nervous? Okay, Alyssa checked her watch, but only 5 minutes has passed. She tapped her pen, filed a nail, and looked at her wrist again. Now he was 7 minutes late. Okay, checked her watch. A couple things happen. She checks her watch again. That gives us that whole feeling of nervousness through the repetition. Again, dialogue, the telling, they started to bicker. All right, we know bicker is like a little argument, but show me the bickering. Don't talk like that to me. Talk like that to you? I've had about enough. Okay, now there's dialogue introduced. I don't have to tell you they're bickering. You can experience. I'm showing you through the dialogue that they are bickering. So please keep in mind, we want to show, not tell. So those are some things to keep in mind as you begin planning your short story. Remember that the more planning you do, the easier the rough draft is going to come for you next week. The second thing that I want to talk about this week is active versus passive voice. And that's definitely going to help you with the show, don't tell. Okay. A verb is considered active, and active and passive voice deals almost specifically with the verbs we're going to use. So a verb is considered active when the subject performs the action. So the subject of your sentence or the subject of your paragraph is the one doing the action. The two examples, Carver developed 75 products from pecans. He's the one developing them. Carver's the subject, he's doing the action. Carver worked with conviction. Carver is the subject, he is doing the work. That is considered an active voice, an active verb. A verb is considered passive if the action is performed upon the subject. That means that there's something else doing the action to the subject. 75 products were developed by Carver from pecans. The work was done with conviction. The importance now is not on Carver having done the action, but now what he did with that. So in the first example, the emphasis is on the 75 products, not the fact that Carver developed them. In the second one, the emphasis is on the work, not who did the work. We don't even know who did the work in that sentence. Okay. Active voice is considered more forceful than passive voice. And you should use active voice whenever possible because it is much more direct and much less wordy. Okay. You'll also notice that the passive voice always uses a helping verb like was or were or is. Okay. whereas active voice uses the much stronger verbs. Passive voice, although I say you should use active voice whenever possible, passive voice does have two important uses in English. Number one, you should use passive voice to emphasize the receiver of an action. For example, wood was carried by Harriet Tubman. In this sentence, maybe Harriet Tubman isn't as important. What's important is that the wood was being carried by her. So in this case, we're emphasizing the wood being carried versus who carried it. And there again, you can see the word was being used as a helping verb with the verb carried. Use passive voice to point out the receiver of an action when the performer is not important. The runaways were saved. Okay, so in this case, we have were saved is our passive voice, and we don't even know who performed that action, who saved the runaways. It's unimportant. What's more important is the fact that the runaways were saved. So we are actually putting the emphasis on the receiver by using the passive voice. For this week, I would like you to practice using the active or passive voice. There are two exercises. This first one has 5 questions. And the second one has 10 questions. For this exercise, you should identify each verb as either active or passive. Then revise those that are passive to active, adding or changing words as necessary. So if you see a sentence, so first go through, decide whether each one is active or passive, and then if it's passive, you want to rewrite the sentence so that you are using the active voice. That may mean that you're going to have to change some of the words around, the order of the words, or even change the words and some of the words entirely. Okay? I would recommend that you pause the video at this point to complete this exercise, and then move on to the second exercise. Exercise number 2, all 10 of these sentences are written in the passive voice. You need to rewrite them as using the active voice. Again, you can change or add any words as necessary to do that. Again, I would recommend that you pause the video now to complete this exercise. Alright, and that is all for this week's direct instruction video. Please make sure that you complete all of your work up until this point to the best ability possible and submit it on time. You need to remember that you must be making your blog entries every week. Those are graded, and they are an important part of your grade and an important part of this creative writing course. If you have any questions about any of your assignments for this week or anything for the course, please send me an email, give me a phone call, let me know what's going on. All right, have a good week. Bye.